Hello, my name is Gavin Whitmore, 38 years old, currently a federal judge in Colorado. I live a life that many might look at and think is enviable. A modest but cozy home in the suburbs of Denver, a respected career, and a reputation built on integrity. But if you ask me about the journey to get here, I would tell you a story that is far from easy. A story of heartbreak, rejection, and moments when I had to question whether I truly belonged anywhere. I grew up in a family that to outsiders could only inspire awe. The Whitmore name was once a symbol of wealth and power in Colorado. My father, Edward Whitmore, was a shrewd real estate mogul who ran Whitmore Properties with an iron hand. My mother, Clara, was an elegant woman, always appearing flawless at charity galas or high society events. They owned lavish homes, took vacations in Europe, and had a network of connections that spanned the country. But behind that glamorous facade was a truth only those inside the family understood. Our family was never truly a home. As the eldest son, I was born with the expectation that I would inherit my father's empire. From a young age, I heard stories about my grandfather, who started with a small office in Boulder and turned it into a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "You're the one to carry it on, Gavin," my father would say, his eyes sharp as if issuing a command rather than encouragement. But I didn't see myself in skyscrapers or million-dollar deals. I loved reading books, debating politics, and dreaming of a world where justice wasn't just a word in textbooks. To my parents, that was a betrayal. When I was 11, I vividly remember one evening at the dinner table. The meal was served on a polished oak table, the light from a crystal chandelier reflecting off expensive porcelain plates. My father was talking about a new condominium project in Denver, his voice brimming with excitement as if it were his greatest achievement. I, a naive 10-year-old, innocently asked, "But if you build condos, where will the poor people living there go?" That question brought the entire table to a halt. My mother looked at me, her brows furrowed as if I had said something offensive. My father gave a wry smile, set down his fork, and said, "Gavin, you need to learn to think like a businessman. The world doesn't run on compassion." I didn't fully understand his words, but I felt the disappointment in his tone. That was the first time I realized I didn't belong in their world. My childhood years passed in subtle tension. My parents never hit or scolded me. They didn't need to. Their coldness, their judgmental glances, and their comparisons to my peers in high society were enough to make me feel like a failure. "Look at the Thompson boy, only 15 and already analyzing financial reports," my mother once said, her voice soft but cutting like a knife. I tried to please them, I really did. I excelled in school, played sports, joined the debate club, but nothing was enough to earn their proud gaze. In their eyes, I was a misfit piece in the perfect puzzle of the Whitmore family. Then came Colton, my younger brother, 3 years my junior. Colton was everything I wasn't: confident, quick-witted, and naturally gifted in business. When he was 12, my father started taking him to company meetings, letting him sit in the corner and learn to be a man. I still remember the sparkle in Colton's eyes when he returned from those trips, glowing as if he had discovered the world. "Gavin, today I met an investor from New York," he once told me, his voice full of excitement. I smiled, patted his shoulder, but inside I felt an emptiness. I knew from that moment Colton had become the family's new hope. By the time I entered high school, the favoritism was undeniable. My parents devoted all their attention to Colton. Private outings with my father, extra lessons in finance, and the rare praise I had never received. Once I won first place in a statewide debate competition and brought the trophy home. My mother glanced at it and said, "Good job, Gavin, but you should focus on more practical things." Meanwhile, when Colton got a B in economics, my father clapped him on the shoulder and said, "That's my boy." I wasn't jealous of Colton. Truly, I loved him. But I couldn't help feeling like a shadow in my own home. Things got worse when it came time to choose a college path. I wanted to study political science at the University of Colorado, a decision I had thought about for a long time. I wanted to understand how political systems worked, to find ways to make the world fairer. But when I told my parents, their reaction was like a punch to the face. "Political science?" my father roared, his voice echoing through the spacious living room. "What do you think you'll become? A failed politician or a penniless lawyer? The Whitmores don't raise dreamers, Gavin." My mother said nothing, but her look, a mix of disappointment and pity, hurt more than my father's words. I still remember that night, sitting in my room staring out the window as the dim streetlights illuminated the trees in the yard. I wondered if I was wrong, if I should give up my dreams to please them. But then I thought of the people I met at debate tournaments, the stories of injustice I had heard, and I knew I couldn't live a life just to satisfy others. I enrolled at the University of Colorado despite my parents' objections. They didn't forbid me, but they did something worse. They stopped talking to me except for curt, cold questions like, "Have you eaten?" or "How's school?" I became a stranger in my own home. After graduating high school, I moved out to start my freshman year of college. My parents didn't contribute a single cent. Everything from tuition to rent I covered through scholarships and a part-time job at a coffee shop. Meanwhile, Colton was sent to a prestigious business school in Boston with all expenses paid by my parents. I didn't blame Colton. He was just pursuing his passion. But every time I heard my mother talk about Colton being invited to a business gala, or my father brag about Colton securing an internship contract, my heart ached. I hadn't just lost my family's support, I had lost the sense of belonging somewhere. My college years were marked by loneliness. I threw myself into my studies, debate tournaments, and thick law books. I discovered I loved the law, not for money or fame, but because it gave me a sense of doing what was right. I dreamed of one day standing in a courtroom not to defend someone's interests, but to defend justice. But every time I visited home for the holidays, I faced cold stares and veiled remarks. "Still haven't changed your mind, Gavin?" my father once asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Still want to be a hero for the poor?" I stayed silent, but inside the fire of determination burned brighter. After graduating college, I continued for 3 years to earn my law degree. It was the hardest time of my life. I worked day and night, studying and taking side jobs to cover expenses. Some nights I only slept 3 hours, my mind reeling with legal codes and hypothetical cases, but I didn't give up. I knew this was my path, no matter how lonely. Meanwhile, Colton had started working for my father's corporation, entrusted with major projects and hailed as the perfect heir. My parents no longer mentioned me in their stories. I became a faded memory, a blemish on the perfect Whitmore family portrait. Then came the day after I graduated law school with my degree in hand, when my father called me back home. As I entered his study, I thought he might reconcile, might say he was proud of me. But no, he handed me a file and said, "This is a dispute with a group of workers. You'll represent the company." I took the file, read through it, and my heart seemed to stop. My father's company had exploited poor workers, paying them below minimum wage and illegally firing those who dared to speak up. The next day, I spoke to my father again. I placed the file on the table and said, "I can't do this. It's wrong." My father looked at me, his eyes burning with rage. "Wrong?" he growled. "Who do you think you are, Gavin? Some knight of justice? This is your family, your legacy." I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He stood up, pointed to the door, and said, "If you don't stand with your family, you're no longer my son." My mother stood there, silent, but I saw tears glistening in her eyes. I left the house with a heavy heart. The gate slammed shut behind me as I walked away, the sound echoing like a final punctuation mark on my connection to the Whitmore family. I stepped out onto the bustling streets of downtown Denver, the biting chill of Colorado's autumn air cutting into my skin. I stood there, hands in my coat pockets, watching the stream of people passing by, and asked myself, where do I go from here? I had no family, no financial support, only a freshly earned law degree and an unwavering belief that justice was worth fighting for. That was the beginning of the next 7 years of my life. 7 years of independence, full of challenges, but also the time that shaped me into the person I am today. The first days after being cut off by my family felt like I was floating between the lines of freedom and loneliness. I moved into a tiny apartment in the suburbs of Denver, where peeling walls and the musty smell of old carpet reminded me of the distance between me and the lavish mansions of my family. My savings were only enough to cover a few months' rent, so I started looking for work immediately. I applied to a small law office downtown that specialized in civil cases for low-income clients. It wasn't a glamorous job. The office was on the third floor of a creaky old building, the elevator squeaking with every trip, and my colleagues were young lawyers struggling just like me. But it was there that I found my purpose. On my first day, I was assigned a case involving a single mother who had been evicted by her landlord for failing to pay rent. I sat across from her in a cramped meeting room, listening as she spoke about her two young children and the sleepless nights filled with worry. "I don't know what to do, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice trembling. I looked into her eyes, and for the first time I felt that the law wasn't just dry text in books. It was a tool to change someone's life. I worked day and night on that case, researching Colorado housing laws, digging for legal precedents, and in the end, we won. The mother hugged me, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Thank you, I never thought I had a chance." In that moment, I knew I had chosen the right path. But life wasn't always full of sweet victories. There were days when I worked myself to exhaustion, returning to my cold apartment wondering if I had the strength to keep going. My meager salary, piling bills, and long nights sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee sometimes made me think back to my days in the Whitmore household. Not for the luxury, but for the feeling of having someone there. I didn't call my parents, and they didn't reach out to me. Occasionally, I'd read about them in the news. Whitmore Properties expands project in Aspen, or Colton Whitmore honored as a promising young entrepreneur. Each time it felt like an invisible knife twisting in my chest. But I told myself, I don't need them. I'll make it on my own. For the first 3 years, I worked like a machine. I took on every case, no matter how small, from contract disputes to defending exploited workers' rights. I learned how to listen, how to argue in court, and how to stand my ground against seasoned lawyers who saw me as a naive young man. But I wasn't naive. I had a fire inside me. A fire forged from years of being belittled by my family, from my father's words that I'd never succeed. Each case I won brought me closer to proving them wrong. By the 4th year, my reputation began to spread in Denver's legal community. People started calling me the poor man's lawyer, a nickname I was both proud of and amused by. I didn't work for fame, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of earning my colleagues' respect. One day, I was invited to a legal conference in Boulder. It was the first time I stood before hundreds of lawyers and judges, speaking about the role of the law in protecting the vulnerable. When I finished my speech, the entire room stood and applauded. An elderly judge, Harold Grayson, approached to shake my hand. "You have the makings of a judge, Gavin," he said, his eyes sharp but warm. "Keep going and you'll go far." Those words were like a gust of wind filling my tattered sails, giving me the strength to press forward. In my 5th year, an unexpected opportunity arose, a position as a state judge in Colorado. It was a turning point I hadn't dared to dream of. The application process was grueling. Intense interviews, questions about professional ethics, and doubts about whether I was too young for the role. But I made it through, thanks to my robust track record and recommendations from colleagues. The day I received my appointment letter, I sat in my small apartment, holding the letter in my hands, and cried. Not out of sadness, but because I realized how far I'd come. From a boy deemed a failure by his parents, I was now a judge, someone with the power to decide the fate of cases and people. Being a judge was different from being a lawyer. Sitting in the judge's chair, I felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. Every ruling was a test of fairness, of holding fast to principles under pressure. Some cases kept me up at night, like one involving a father accused of theft to feed his children. I had to balance compassion with the law, weighing the chance to give him a second chance against the need to uphold societal order. But with every ruling, I reminded myself, this is why I chose this path, to uphold justice, not to please anyone. Over those 7 years, I didn't just build a career, I built a new life. I made friends with colleagues who shared my belief in justice. I got involved in community activities like teaching law for free to high school students in poor neighborhoods. I bought an old bicycle and rode around Denver on weekends, savoring the crisp Rocky Mountain air. I learned to cook, mostly unsuccessfully, and found joy in simple things like reading by the window on rainy days. But no matter how full my life became, there was still an emptiness inside me. I no longer had contact with my family, but I couldn't deny that I missed them. My mother, Colton, and strangely, even my father. Occasionally, I'd hear about Colton through the news. He had become the vice president of Whitmore Properties, hailed as a rising star in the business world. My parents seemed to have placed all their faith in him, as if I had never existed. I wasn't jealous, but I wondered if Colton was truly happy living in our father's shadow, or if he too was struggling as I once had. I wanted to call him to check in, but every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. They don't need me, I told myself, and went on living my own life. By the 7th year, I had become a respected judge in Colorado. My name appeared in the news not as the Whitmore son, but as Judge Gavin Whitmore, champion of justice. I received thank you letters from people I'd helped, from young lawyers who saw me as a role model. But I never forgot the hard days, the lonely nights, and the times I had to pick myself up after every fall. I knew, no matter how successful I became, I still carried the scars from my family. Scars that reminded me of the steep price I paid to become the person I am today. I could never have imagined that after 7 years, fate would bring me face to face with my family again. Not in a warm reunion, but in a courtroom, where I would have to issue a ruling about my own brother. It was a moment when everything I had built, my reputation, my principles, and my belief in myself, would be tested in the most brutal way. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, adjusting my tie, trying to keep my breathing steady. The black judge's robe lay neatly folded on the chair, ready for me to put on, but today it felt heavier than usual. I had presided over hundreds of trials, handling cases from petty theft to financial fraud, but never had my heart raced like this. Today, the defendant was no stranger. It was Colton Whitmore, my younger brother, the boy I once carried in my arms, the one I used to play basketball with in our backyard. And now, he stood before me, accused of financial fraud in a case tied to the family's corporation. I entered the courtroom at the Colorado State Courthouse, the air thick with the smell of old wood and the murmurs of those in attendance. The seats were packed, journalists, lawyers, and curious onlookers eager to witness the trial of business star Colton Whitmore. I took my place at the bench, my gaze sweeping the room. And then I saw them, my father and mother, seated in the front row. My father, Edward Whitmore, still exuded authority in his expensive suit, but his face was more haggard than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. My mother, Clara, looked smaller, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes flickering between anxiety and hope. They didn't look at me, not a nod or a glance of acknowledgement. I was the judge, but to them I was still the traitor. I struck the gavel and the trial began. The prosecutor stood, delivering the charges with a sharp tone. Colton was accused of manipulating Whitmore Properties' accounting records, funneling millions of dollars into offshore accounts to evade taxes and conceal illicit profits. The evidence included emails, bank documents, and testimony from former employees. I listened, taking notes, but my mind kept drifting to old memories. Images of Colton at 10, running after me in the park, laughing loudly when I let him win a race. How had he come to this? Colton's defense attorney, a confident middle-aged man, argued that it was merely an accounting error and that Colton had no criminal intent. But I looked into my brother's eyes at the defendant's table and saw something off. Colton was no longer the carefree boy of our childhood. His gaze was evasive, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. I wondered, was this the price of living under our father's expectations? The trial stretched through the day with tense arguments from both sides. I maintained a calm exterior, but inside I was waging a fierce battle. Each piece of evidence felt like a knife, not just to Colton but to the entire Whitmore family, to the legacy my father always boasted about. When the court recessed, I retreated to my chambers, closed the door, and sat down, my hands cradling my head. I wanted to scream, to call Colton and ask, "Why, little brother? Why did you let things go this far?" But I couldn't. I was the judge, and my duty was to uphold justice, not to let emotions sway me. On the second day, I received a message from the court clerk. "Someone wishes to see you, Judge Whitmore." I nodded, assuming it was a lawyer or witness. But when the door opened, my mother walked in. She wore a simple gray sweater, far plainer than the glamorous dresses of her past. "Gavin," she said, her voice trembling, "I just want to talk to you for a moment." I gestured for her to sit, but my heart tightened. This was the first time I'd spoken to her in 7 years. "Are you doing well?" she asked, her eyes searching as if looking for the boy I once was. I nodded, replying curtly, "I'm fine, Mom." She was silent for a moment, then said, "Colton, he didn't mean it, Gavin. He was just under pressure. Your father, he put too many expectations on him. You know that, don't you?" I looked at her, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Mom, I can't discuss the case. I'm the judge." She nodded, but her eyes were pleading. "I just want you to remember that Colton is your brother. Family is everything, Gavin." I didn't respond, only stood, opened the door, and said gently, "You should return to your seat. The trial is about to resume." As she left, I felt a piece of my heart shatter. But I knew that if I let emotions take over, I'd lose myself. On the third day, my father made his move. Not directly, but through an intermediary. Harold Grayson, the retired judge who had once praised me years ago. Grayson entered my chambers with a friendly smile, but I sensed something was off. "Gavin," he said in a low voice, "I hear you're handling a big case. You know, a judge's career sometimes depends on how you handle sensitive situations." I furrowed my brow and asked bluntly, "What do you mean?" He chuckled, patting my shoulder. "Just advice, young man. Sometimes a little leniency can save you trouble down the road." I understood immediately. This was my father's way, using connections to pressure me. I stood, looking him in the eye. "Thank you for the advice, but I'll handle the case according to the law. No exceptions." He left, his smile fading, and I knew I had just rejected an implicit threat. The pressure from my family didn't stop there. One evening, when I returned home, I found a handwritten letter in my mailbox. My mother's elegant handwriting, the same I'd seen on Christmas cards when I was a child. I opened it, and each line pulled me back to those old days. She wrote about mornings when Colton and I ran out to play in the yard, about the time Colton fell and I carried him home on my back. "You and your brother were our whole world," she wrote. "Don't let justice destroy our family, Gavin." I sat there, the letter trembling in my hands. I knew this wasn't just a heartfelt note, it was a tactic to make me feel guilty. But I didn't respond. I folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer, and told myself, I can't let them sway me. The trial reached its critical phase. The prosecutor presented further evidence, an email from Colton to a colleague, explicitly instructing them to adjust the numbers to protect the company's reputation. I looked at Colton, hoping he'd deny it, say it was fabricated, but he just bowed his head, silent. His defense attorney tried to spin the narrative, but it was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. A sharp pain pierced my chest, not because Colton might be convicted, but because I realized my brother had gone too far, swept up in ambition and our father's pressure. As the trial neared its end, I allowed Colton to make a final statement. He stood, his voice trembling. I just wanted to make my parents proud. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I only did what I thought was necessary. Those words cut like a knife. I looked at my parents in the front row. My mother bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. My father sat upright, but his eyes were empty, as if he was realizing for the first time what he had done to his son. I struck the gavel, called a recess, and retreated to my chambers. I needed time to breathe, to sort through the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the dim streetlights, thinking about Colton, my parents, and everything that had led us here. I knew my ruling would change everything, not just for Colton, but for the entire family. But I also knew that if I didn't uphold my principles, I'd lose myself. Tomorrow I would walk into the courtroom, put on my black robe, and deliver my verdict. Not as a brother, but as a judge, a guardian of justice, even if it broke my heart. The morning of the final trial day arrived. I stood before the courtroom door, my hands gripping the edges of my black robe. My breathing was heavy, as if the air in the corridor of the Colorado State Courthouse was pressing against my chest. Today was the last day of Colton's trial, my younger brother, and I knew the verdict I delivered would not only determine his fate, but also forever alter my relationship with my family, if there was anything left to call a relationship. 7 years of no contact, 7 years of building my own life, all seemed to lead me to this moment, a judge standing at the crossroads of justice and family ties. I pushed the door open, the creak of the wooden frame sounding like a warning. The courtroom was packed. Journalists sat in the left corner, their pens scribbling furiously, cameras discreetly capturing every moment. Curious onlookers drawn to the trial of business star Colton Whitmore whispered among themselves, creating a low hum like waves lapping at the shore. In the front row, my father and mother sat, separated by an invisible divide. My father, Edward Whitmore, maintained his stoic demeanor, but I noticed his shoulders trembling slightly, a rare sign of unease. My mother, Clara, looked as if she hadn't slept in days, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands clutching a white handkerchief. They didn't look at me, but I felt their gazes like invisible needles piercing my skin. I took my seat at the bench and struck the gavel. The sharp sound cut through the room, commanding silence. "We will continue the trial of Colton Whitmore," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. The prosecutor, Elena Martinez, a sharp woman with her hair neatly tied back, stood. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear. "Today we present our final piece of evidence, a document we believe will fully clarify the defendant's actions." I nodded, signaling her to proceed. But as Ms. Martinez stepped forward, I caught a glimpse of Colton at the defendant's table, his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked trapped, no longer the quick-witted boy who used to chase me around our backyard, nor the confident entrepreneur the press once lauded. I tried to push that image out of my mind, reminding myself, "You're a judge, Gavin, not a brother." Ms. Martinez presented a set of documents marked with bold red numbers. "These are internal reports from Whitmore Properties provided by an unexpected witness, Ms. Ana Delgado, the company's former chief accountant." The courtroom buzzed. I struck the gavel, demanding order, but my eyes couldn't leave the documents. Ana Delgado, the name rang like a faint memory. I remembered her, a dedicated middle-aged woman who had worked for my father since I was a child. She had retired a few years ago, and now she emerged as a game changer. Ms. Delgado took the witness stand, her petite frame contrasted by her resolute gaze. She swore to tell the truth, and as Ms. Martinez began questioning her, the air in the room seemed to thicken. "Ms. Delgado," Martinez asked, "can you explain these documents?" Delgado nodded, her voice calm but incisive. "These are internal records I uncovered while working at Whitmore Properties. They show that Colton Whitmore directed the transfer of funds to offshore accounts, not only to evade taxes but also to conceal profits from illegal real estate transactions. I warned Mr. Edward Whitmore, but he instructed me to stay silent." The courtroom erupted. Whispers turned into muffled shouts, and I had to strike the gavel repeatedly to restore order. I glanced at my father, and for the first time in my life I saw him stripped of his confidence. His face was ashen, his lips pressed tightly together as if he'd been dealt a devastating blow. My mother gripped his hand, but he brushed her off, his eyes fixed on Delgado. I knew what he was thinking. How could a trusted former employee dare to stand against the Whitmore family? I looked at Colton, hoping he would stand, deny it, or at least offer an explanation. But he just sat there, his head bowed even lower, as if willing himself to vanish. His defense attorney, Richard Holt, tried to counter, arguing that Delgado might have fabricated the documents out of personal resentment. But it was clear. The evidence was too strong, too detailed to dismiss. I took notes, trying to keep my hand from trembling, but my heart felt crushed. This wasn't just a case. It was the story of my family, of my parents' mistakes, of the pressure that had driven Colton to this path. The trial grew more intense than I had anticipated. By the afternoon, I called both sides to present their closing arguments. Ms. Martinez emphasized that Colton's actions were not just financial fraud, but a betrayal of the trust of those who had invested in Whitmore properties. Mr. Holt appealed to compassion, arguing that Colton was a victim of family pressure, that he deserved a chance to make amends. I listened, took notes, but in my mind one question lingered. What do I do next? When the time came to deliver my verdict, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I stood, the black robe heavy on my shoulders, my voice ringing out calm but resolute. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the court finds the defendant, Colton Whitmore, guilty of financial fraud and money laundering. Under Colorado state and federal law, the defendant is sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay $2.5 million in restitution to the affected parties. I paused, looking directly at Colton. The law does not distinguish between blood ties. Justice must be served. The room fell silent, broken only by my mother's sobs. Colton's shoulders shook, his head bowed. My father stood abruptly and stormed out of the courtroom without a glance in my direction. My mother remained, cradling her face as if her world had collapsed. The press began scribbling frantically, and I heard whispers. Judge Whitmore, the man who showed no mercy even to his own brother. I struck the gavel, ending the trial, and left the courtroom, each step feeling like it carried the weight of lead. Back in my chambers, I closed the door, removed my robe, and sank into my chair. I didn't cry. I had learned to suppress tears long ago, but I felt a vast emptiness inside. I had done the right thing, I knew that. But why did it hurt so much? I looked out the window, the late afternoon sun casting rays over Denver's skyscrapers, and wondered, will my family ever understand that I did this not out of hatred, but out of belief in justice? That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove to the outskirts of town, stopping on a quiet road near the Rocky Mountains. I stepped out, breathing in the biting cold air, and looked up at the star-filled sky. I thought about Colton, the years we were brothers, and my parents who might never forgive me. But I also thought about the people my verdict had protected. The small investors, the exploited employees, those who believed in the legal system. And I knew no matter the cost, I had made the right choice. The days following the trial passed in an unfamiliar atmosphere, one I had never experienced despite having handled hundreds of complex cases. The press began writing about my brother's case, calling me the judge of justice, praising my impartiality for showing no leniency, even toward my own brother. Those articles should have made me proud, but each line served only as a reminder that I had lost my family in exchange for that reputation. About a week later, my father made his first move, and it was not unexpected. In an interview with the Denver Post, he said, "Edward Whitmore, my son betrayed the family." I sat at my breakfast table, a cold cup of coffee in hand, reading each line in the newspaper. Gavin chose to side with the law over his family, my father said. He thinks he's a hero, but he's just a selfish man who destroyed the legacy we built. Those words didn't surprise me, but they still cut into my heart like a blade. I was used to my father's criticism, but this time it was public, laid bare for the world to see. He called me a traitor, as if I had deliberately hurt the family, as if I hadn't endured sleepless nights to reach that verdict. The public's reaction, however, was the complete opposite. My father's interview sparked a wave of controversy on social media. Posts began appearing with hundreds of people defending me. Judge Whitmore did the right thing. Justice has no room for favoritism. One account wrote, Edward Whitmore should reflect on how he pushed his son onto the wrong path instead of blaming the one upholding the law. I'm not one to browse social media, but my court clerk, Sarah, printed out a few posts and handed them to me. You should read these, she said, a slight smile on her lips. The people are on your side. I smiled back, but inside I felt no triumph. The public's support couldn't fill the void left by my family. My mother reacted very differently. She didn't go to the press or publicly criticize me like my father. Instead, I received a phone call from her. I hesitated, but finally picked up. Gavin, her voice came through, frail but warm. Can I see you? I was silent for a moment, my heart racing. After 7 years of no contact, after everything that happened in the courtroom, I wasn't sure I was ready to face her. But I agreed. This afternoon at the cafe on 16th Street, I said, my voice dry. The cafe was a place I often worked at on weekends, a quiet little corner with red brick walls and the rich aroma of roasted coffee. When I arrived, my mother was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in front of her. She looked much older than the last time I saw her in the courtroom, her hair grayer, her shoulders frail in a beige sweater. As I sat down, she looked up, her eyes seeming to hold 1,000 unspoken words but unsure where to begin. Are you doing well, Gavin? She asked, her voice gentle like when I was a child. I nodded, not wanting emotions to take over. I'm fine, Mom. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. I've read the articles about you, she said. They call you a hero. But I know it wasn't easy for you. I didn't respond, just stared at the coffee cup in front of me, waiting. I knew she hadn't come just to chat. She took a deep breath and said, I was wrong, Gavin. Your father and we put too much pressure on you and Colton. I thought that if we pushed you onto the path we chose, you'd be happy. But I was wrong. Her admission stunned me. Growing up, my mother had never admitted fault. She had always stood behind my father, supporting his decisions no matter how harsh. When I saw Colton in the courtroom, she continued, her voice trembling, I realized I had a part in pushing him down that path. And you did the right thing, no matter how painful it was. I looked at her, searching for words, but my throat tightened. Mom, I finally said, I didn't want to hurt anyone. But I couldn't let emotions sway my verdict. If I had, I would have lost myself. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know, she whispered, and I'm proud of you, Gavin. I wish we hadn't let things go this far. The meeting lasted less than an hour, but it changed something in me. For the first time in years, I felt a faint connection with my mother. Not a full reconciliation, but a sign that she was beginning to understand me, to understand what I had fought to uphold. As we parted, she took my hand, squeezed it gently, and said, I'll always be here if you need me. I didn't respond, but I nodded. And as she walked out of the cafe, I felt a part of the burden in my heart lift. 2 years have passed since Colton's trial, and my life has changed in ways I never could have anticipated. I still live in my small apartment in the suburbs of Denver, still ride my old bicycle along tree-lined streets on weekends, but I am no longer the Gavin Whitmore of 7 years ago, the one who struggled to prove his worth. Now I am a federal judge, a significant milestone in a career built on sweat and tears. But beyond the title, I have found an inner peace, a sense of freedom I didn't know I needed until I lost my family. The day I was appointed as a federal judge was an unforgettable milestone. The ceremony took place at the federal courthouse in downtown Denver, a majestic building with marble columns and a solemn atmosphere. Colleagues, friends, and even people I had helped through past cases were there. applauding as I stepped up to receive my appointment letter. Among them, I saw my mother sitting in the third row wearing a simple light blue dress, a faint smile on her lips. She came alone. My father was absent and I wasn't surprised. But her quiet presence was enough to warm my heart. After the ceremony, my mother approached me, her hands trembling as she hugged me. "Gavin," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I'm proud of you. You chose your own path, and I admire you for it." Those words, simple but sincere, were something I never thought I'd hear from her. I hugged her back, feeling the warmth of an embrace I had longed for since childhood. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. And for the first time in years, I felt I could forgive not just her, but myself as well. In the 2 years following Colton's trial, I regularly visited him in prison. Those visits were never easy. Colton, now nearly 2 years into his sentence, kept a distance from me. He sat across from me behind thick glass, his eyes empty, often responding with short phrases. "I'm fine," he'd say whenever I asked, but I saw the bitterness in his gaze, as if he blamed me for everything that had happened. Once I brought an old photo of us taken during a summer vacation on a California beach, hoping it would stir some warm memories. "I miss those days," I said, sliding the photo through the slot. Colton looked at it for a moment, then pushed it back, his voice cold. "Those days don't mean anything anymore, Gavin. You chose justice over me." His words cut like a knife, but I didn't argue. I just nodded, said, "I'll be back next month," and left, carrying an indescribable pain. Still, I didn't give up on Colton. I kept visiting, bringing books, telling him about the cases I was handling, and sometimes just sitting in silence with him. I held on to a faint hope that one day he would understand I didn't convict him out of hatred, but because I believed justice was the only way for him to face and amend his mistakes. What comforted me was that my mother began to re-enter my life. She occasionally sent emails asking about my work, my health, and sometimes sharing updates about her visits to Colton. Once she invited me to dinner at the old restaurant our family used to frequent when I was a child. We sat across from each other, eating the steak I used to love, and for the first time we talked like friends, not as mother and son divided by invisible barriers. "It took me years to understand you, Gavin," she said, her eyes glinting with regret. "But I'm happy you found your path." I smiled, took her hand, and said, "I'm happy you're here too." But with my father, the door to reconciliation remained firmly shut. He lived in his own world, one where the Whitmore legacy was everything, and I was the traitor who destroyed it. I didn't try to reach out to him, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew he wasn't ready. Perhaps one day he'll look back and realize that family isn't about reputation or power, but about love and understanding. But I don't wait for that day. I've learned to live without his approval. Now, as I sit in my office at the federal courthouse, looking out at Denver's skyscrapers and the misty Rocky Mountains in the distance, I reflect on my journey. I went from a boy deemed a failure by his family to a lawyer fighting for the vulnerable, to a respected federal judge. But my legacy isn't in titles or glowing articles. My legacy lies in the fair rulings I've made, the lives I've touched, and the lessons I've learned from my own scars. My journey hasn't been easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I could have done things differently, if I could have saved Colton from his wrong path or made my father understand that justice isn't betrayal. But I've learned that you can't change others, only live true to yourself. I don't regret my verdict in Colton's case, even though it cost me part of my family. I believe that justice, however harsh, is the only way to confront mistakes and find a chance for redemption. I don't seek reconciliation with my father or Colton, not because I don't love them, but because I know reconciliation can't be forced. My father still lives in his world where reputation is everything. Colton, though still bitter, is slowly finding himself in the final months of his sentence. I keep visiting him, carrying the hope that one day he'll understand. As for my mother, she has become a part of my life again. Not as it was before, but enough to make me feel I'm not entirely alone. If I could leave one piece of advice, it would be this: Live according to what you believe is right, even if it means going against others' expectations. Justice, integrity, and honesty with yourself are values that can't be traded. There will be times when you feel lonely, misunderstood, or even rejected by those you love most. But remember that your worth isn't in others' approval, but in how you rise after each fall, how you hold fast to your principles no matter the cost. I look out the window, the afternoon sun illuminating the snow-capped peaks, and I smile. I don't have a perfect family, nor the wealth or power my father once wanted me to inherit. But I have a legacy of my own, a life dedicated to justice, a heart free of resentment, and a steadfast belief that no matter how harsh the world may be, integrity will always light the way. And I hope, truly hope, that you too will live a life of integrity and honor.